My name is Claire Navarro. I am 28 years old. And the evening my father slid a sealed envelope across the birthday dinner table at Orso Trattoria and told me it was something real was the evening I understood that the people who love you most will sometimes try to rescue you from the life you have already chosen. The envelope was white, letter-sized, his handwriting on the front. Not my name, just an address. A company name in the upper left corner I didn't recognize. I looked at it for 1 second before he said, "Open it." It's a graphic design position. Benefits.
Salary.
Something with a future. My Aunt Rosa sat across from me, with her hands folded. She said, "Painting doesn't pay rent, Claire." She said it the way people say things they believe are helpful, flatly, without decoration, as though the plainness of the delivery made it more true. My cousin Danny reached across and patted my hand. Once, twice. The way you pat the hand of someone who has just received difficult news and needs steadying. I looked at each of them in turn. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip and set it back down on the exact same ring it had left on the tablecloth. I said, "Thank you, Dad." I folded the envelope once and put it in my bag. I ate the rest of my risotto. I paid my portion of the bill. I hugged everyone at the door in the November cold outside Orso, and I walked to my car and I drove home. Home was an apartment on Vellard Street, 12 minutes from Orso Trattoria, that my family had never been inside. The man I had been married to for 11 months was there when I got back. He was at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a half-eaten bowl of pasta next to it, and he looked up when I came in, and I put my bag on the chair by the door and sat down across from him and told him about the envelope. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Do you want me to come to the next one?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "Okay," and went back to his laptop. What my family did not know, what I had told no one except my closest friend Marta, and even Marta only knew part of it, was that my husband's name was Daniel Osei. And that 3 weeks before the birthday dinner at Orso Trattoria, a business journalist named Patricia Hale had sent Daniel an email requesting an interview for a feature she was writing on emerging figures in sustainable urban development. The magazine was Forbes. I kept that to myself. I drove home from Orso Trattoria, sat across from my husband, and said nothing about any of it. I had learned by 28 exactly how much to say and when. I want to tell you about the work first because the work is the whole story. Everything else, the dinner, the envelope, the magazine, is just the surface. The work is what was underneath. I had been painting seriously since I was 19, when I took my first life drawing class at the community college on Fenwick Avenue and understood, in the first session, that this was the thing I was going to spend my life doing. Not as a decision exactly, more as a recognition. The way you recognize a face you have been trying to remember. I was not immediately good at it in the way people mean when they say someone is talented. I was committed in a way that looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from stubbornness. I drew badly, and then less badly. I painted in student acrylics on canvas board, and then in oils on stretched canvas. I took every class I could afford and several I could not, working 22 hours a week at a coffee shop on Brackett Street to cover tuition, supplies, and half of the rent on an apartment I shared with 2 other students on the east side of the city. My father had wanted me to study something practical. He had a landscaping business he had built from a single truck and a borrowed leaf blower into a 12-person operation over 20 years, and the ethic underneath everything he did was specific and unwavering. You build something with your hands that produces a measurable result that someone will pay you for reliably. Art did not fit that framework. Not because he was incurious or closed. He was neither, but because he had watched too many people in his family mistake passion for a plan, and the cost of that mistake in his experience was not abstract. He had said this to me when I was 20, when I told him I was not going to transfer to a 4-year business program after my second year at Fenwick. He said it carefully and without cruelty, sitting at the kitchen table of the house on Marsden Road where I had grown up, with his coffee going cold in front of him. He said, "Claire, I want you to be honest with yourself about what this is." He said, "I'm not saying don't paint. I'm saying don't mistake something you love for something that will support you." I heard him. I thought about what he said for 3 weeks, which is longer than I think about most things. And then I enrolled in a studio arts program at a state university 40 minutes north of the city and told him at dinner the following Sunday. He did not argue. He picked up his coffee. He said, "Okay." He said it the way he said things when he had made his position clear and was choosing not to repeat it. That was the last time we discussed it directly until the envelope at Orso Trattoria, 8 years later. The specific thing I was good at, the thing that took longest to identify, and then once identified, defined every serious piece of work I made, was architectural space. Not buildings as objects. Buildings as inhabited things. The way a facade changes when you understand who built it and why. The way light falls differently on a structure that was designed for a specific human purpose versus one that evolved without intention. The way a city block holds its history and its proportions and its wear patterns and the relationship between its structures and the street. I discovered this working on a series of observational sketches in my third year of the university program, a project that was supposed to be about gesture drawing, but that I kept steering toward the built environment because the built environment was where I kept looking. My studio instructor that year was a man named Victor Lane, a working painter in his 50s who divided his time between the university and a studio practice that had produced 4 gallery shows in the previous decade. Victor was not warm in the conventional sense. He communicated mostly in precise observations delivered without softening, but he was genuinely attentive, and he was the first person in an instructional context who told me I was doing something specific rather than something general. He said, after looking at the sketch series for a long time without speaking, "You're painting the relationship between a structure and the decision to build it. That's not what most people do when they paint buildings." He said, "Stay with that. It's going to take you 5 years to understand what you're actually doing, but stay with it." I stayed with it. After graduating, I moved into a one-room studio apartment on Bellard Street, the same building I still lived in, different unit, and set up a workspace in the corner nearest the window, which had north-facing light that was flat and consistent and technically useful. I worked a part-time administrative job at an architecture firm called Halcott and Reed, 3 days a week, which paid $22,000 annually and gave me access to a professional library of architectural drawings, site surveys, and project documentation that became, over 2 years, as formative as any class I had taken. I was not an architect. I was filing, scheduling, answering phones. But I was inside the vocabulary of the work every day, and I absorbed it the way you absorb a language when you live in the country rather than studying it from a textbook. I painted every morning before the administrative job, and on weekends, and on the 2 weekdays I didn't go in. I painted the building across the street from my apartment in 17 different light conditions over a period of 14 months. I painted the Garfield Avenue Bridge from 6 different positions along the riverbank. I painted the interior of the Fenwick Avenue train station at 4 in the morning with permission from a facilities supervisor named Deb Okonkwo, who had looked at my portfolio photographs and said, without particular ceremony, "Tuesday through Thursday. Don't touch anything." The first gallery that showed my work was a small commercial space on the north side called Threshold, run by a woman named Ingrid Sato, who specialized in emerging painters working in realist traditions. Ingrid had seen the Bridge series in a group show and contacted me through the gallery's email. She offered me a wall for 6 weeks. I sold 3 pieces. The total was $4,200. I had spent 14 months on the series. I did not tell my father. I did not tell my Aunt Rosa. I did not tell Danny. I told Marta, who took me to dinner to celebrate and insisted on paying, and I told Victor Lane in an email, who replied with 3 words, "Good. Keep going." I kept going. I met Daniel at a site walkthrough. I want to be precise about this because people tend to construct a different story when they hear artist meets wealthy husband, and I would rather give you the actual one. Halcott and Reed had a contract with a development company called Osei Group on a mixed-use project in the warehouse district on the city's east side. Daniel Osei was the principal of Osei Group. He came in for a project review meeting on a Thursday afternoon in April, and I was the person who set up the conference room, printed the site plans, and made sure the coffee was ready. He thanked me for the coffee with specific attention, not as a performance but as a habit, the way some people have the habit of noticing the people who do the invisible work. I noticed that he noticed. We talked for 4 minutes in the hallway after the meeting while he waited for his car. He asked what else I did at the firm. I said I was a painter working part-time. He asked what I painted. I said buildings. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Which buildings?" I told him about the bridge series. He asked if the work was visible anywhere. I said threshold on the north side, for the next 3 weeks. He said, "I'll go look." He went the following Saturday. He bought the large bridge piece, the one I had been most uncertain about, the early morning composition with the light coming off the water at an oblique angle for $1,800. He sent a note through the gallery. The note said, "The water in the lower left corner is doing something I don't have words for. Thank you." I replied, through Ingrid. He replied back. We had coffee 6 days later at a place on Dunmore Street that he had chosen because it was close to another Halcott and Reed project site, and he wanted to show me something about the building next door. He had noticed something in the proportions of the facade that reminded him of something I had told him about the bridge composition, and he wanted to see if I saw what he saw. I saw it. That was the beginning. We were careful, for reasons that were practical rather than secret. Daniel was a client of Halcott and Reed's, which created a professional entanglement that neither of us wanted to complicate. I spoke to my direct supervisor at the firm, an office manager named Carolyn Fitch, within 2 weeks of our first coffee, because I did not want to manage something quietly that had professional implications. Carolyn's response was measured and direct. She would note it. It was not a violation of firm policy provided the relationship did not involve me in project decisions affecting OSE Group, and she appreciated me flagging it early. I was moved off the OSE Group file within the month. The rest was our own business. We dated for 1.5 years. We were engaged for 7 months. We married in March at the city clerk's office with Marta and Daniel's closest friend, a man named Kwame Asante, as witnesses. We had dinner afterward at a restaurant on the water that Daniel had chosen and I had never been to, and the 4 of us talked for 4 hours, and it was exactly what I wanted a wedding to be. I had not told my family I was seeing someone. This was not strategy, or not only strategy. It was partly that the rhythm of our relationship had developed in a space entirely separate from the family context, and I was protective of that space in the instinctive way you are protective of things that are working well. My father had opinions about the kind of person I should be with, expressed not in direct statements but in cumulative questions over years, whether the person had stability, whether they had a plan, whether they could demonstrate reliability in the concrete measurable ways he respected. I knew that introducing Daniel would require a series of conversations I was not prepared to have while the relationship was still becoming what it was going to be. And then it was what it was going to be, and we were married, and I still hadn't said anything, and then several more months passed, and the birthday dinner at Orso Trattoria arrived with the envelope, and I sat across from my father and my aunt and my cousin and said, "Thank you, Dad," and drove home to a husband they didn't know I had. I was not ashamed of any part of it. I was protecting something that did not need their input to exist. The Forbes piece had its origins in a project that had nothing to do with either of us directly, a public transit infrastructure initiative in the city's southern corridor that OSE Group had partnered with 2 other development firms to bid on, a large-scale mixed-use proposal that combined affordable housing, retail, and transit access in a way that the city's planning department had described, at a public meeting, as the most coherent response to a decade-old density problem they had seen. From a private developer. The bid was competitive. OSE Group won it. The announcement was made at a city council session in October, and it was covered by the local business press with the standard treatment: project details, dollar figures for the public record, names of the firms involved. Daniel's name appeared in 3 of the articles. I read them at my desk in the Vellard Street studio on a Tuesday morning while the first painting of a new series was drying on the easel behind me. Patricia Hale, the Forbes journalist, had been tracking OSE Group since the bid was submitted. Her feature was not specifically about the transit project. It was a broader piece on a cohort of under 40 developers working at the intersection of density, sustainability, and public infrastructure in mid-size American cities, and Daniel was one of 4 subjects. She contacted him in late October. They spoke twice by phone and once in person at the OSE Group offices before she filed.
She did not contact me.
The piece was about Daniel's work, not mine. The magazine published in the first week of December. Daniel texted me a link the morning it went live online, before the print edition hit stands. The text said, "It's up." I opened the link at the kitchen table with my coffee. The piece ran approximately 2,000 words. Daniel's section was about 600 of them. Patricia Hale had written about the transit project, about OSE Group's approach to community engagement in the planning phase, about Daniel's background and his trajectory from a single small renovation project to a firm with 7 active developments across 3 cities. The headline of the full piece used the word visionary, which Daniel found embarrassing and said so at dinner that evening. I told him he would survive it. The print edition reached newsstands 3 days later. My father subscribed to the print edition of Forbes. He had subscribed for as long as I could remember, not because he moved in those circles, but because he believed in staying informed about the world his business operated adjacent to. He had a stack of back issues on the credenza in his office at the landscaping company's shop on Industrial Drive, organized by month. He saw Daniel's name on a Tuesday morning. He told me later it took him a moment to register it. Ose is not a common surname in our family's context, and his first read was for the project, not the person. Then he read the biographical section. And the word wife appeared in the 4th paragraph of Daniel's profile, in a sentence where Patricia Hale had written about how Daniel structured his personal time, and she had written, with no particular emphasis, that he was married to a painter whose work had recently been included in a regional juried exhibition. My father read that sentence twice. Then he read it a 3rd time. He called my phone at 9:47 in the morning. I was in the studio. I let it ring. He called again at 10:03. I let that ring too. He texted at 10:11. Claire, call me when you can. Then, for minutes later, I read the magazine. Then, after a pause that I can account for because I was watching the timestamps, is this Daniel Ose your husband? I finished the section of the painting I was working on. I cleaned my brush. I sat down on the stool next to the easel and called him back. He answered before the first ring completed. The conversation with my father lasted 41 minutes. I have gone over it many times in the months since, and what I keep coming back to is not what was said but the quality of his attention during it, the way he asked questions slowly with pauses between them, the way a person asks when they are trying to understand something rather than confirm what they already believe. He said, "How long?" I said, "We've been married 11 months. Together for 2.5 years before that." A long pause. He said, "At Orso?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You drove home to him that night?" I said, "Yes." Another pause. He said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I had prepared for this question, not in the sense of rehearsing an answer, but in the sense of having thought about the honest one. I said, "Because I needed to build something without it being examined before it was finished. The same way I needed to build the painting without explaining it before I understood it myself." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I heard him shift in his chair. He said, "That's fair." Then, I would have liked to know him." I said, "You can know him now." He said, Is he good to you?" I said, "Yes, entirely." He said, "Okay." And then, after a pause, that sentence, "In the magazine, about the painter." I said, "I saw it." He said, "The juried exhibition." I said, "The Meridian Regional in September. 3 pieces." He said, "I didn't know about that either." I said, "No." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I have the envelope, the job application. I still have it in my desk." I said, "I know." He said, "I think I owe you an apology for that." I said, "I think you were afraid for me the same way you've always been afraid for me. And I think that's different from being wrong about me, even if the action was wrong." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You sound like your grandmother." He said it like a fact, not a compliment, but his grandmother had been a woman he spoke about with a specific reverence that I had understood since childhood. It was the highest version of what he knew how to say. I said, "I'll take that." He said, "When can we meet him?" I said, "Sunday if you want. We'll come to the house." He said, "I'll tell your mother to make lunch."
He paused.
"Don't tell Rosa yet. Let me talk to her first." I said I understood. We got off the phone. I sat on the stool next to the easel for a few minutes. The painting behind me was a commission, a mid-rise residential building in the warehouse district, one of OSE Group's completed projects, requested by the firm's office for their main conference room. I had been working on the light in the upper third for 3 sessions. I stood up, picked up the brush I had cleaned, and went back to it. Aunt Rosa called on a Thursday. My father had spoken to her on Wednesday evening, which I knew because he had sent me a text that said only, "Talk to Rosa.
She'll call you."
He had not elaborated on what had been said or how it had gone, and I had not asked. Rosa and I have never had a simple relationship. She is my father's older sister by 4 years, and she occupied a particular role in the family structure. The one who said the things my father would think but not say, the external voice of the internal consensus. She had done this my entire life with a directness that I had, depending on the moment, respected or found exhausting. She called the painting doesn't pay rent comment a statement of fact. She would have stood by it before the magazine. She called at 7 in the evening. I was in the kitchen starting dinner. I answered. She said, "Claire." I said, "Hi, Rosa." A pause. She said, "Your father told me." I said, "I figured." She said, "How long have you been keeping this?" It was not quite a question. I said, "About 2.5 years since we started seeing each other. 11 months since the wedding." She was quiet. Then she said, with a particular precision I recognized as costing her something, "I said something unkind or so." I said, "Yes." She said, "I said it because I believed it. I want you to know that. I wasn't being cruel for the sake of being cruel. I genuinely believed you were making a mistake." I said, "I know." She said, "I was looking at the wrong thing." I said, "You were looking at what you could see." Another pause. She said, "The painting in the magazine. The one she mentioned." I said, "The Meridian Regional. It's a juried show, competitive entry, independent jury. 3 of mine were selected." She said, "I didn't know you were in shows." I said, "I've been in 6 over the past 4 years. Threshold on the north side, the Cavell Gallery downtown twice, the university's faculty and alumni show 2 years running." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I did not expect. She said, "I want to see the work, Claire. Not the magazine. The actual work. Is that possible?" I said, "Yes. Come to the studio." She said, "When?" I said, "Whenever you want." She came the following Saturday alone, without calling to confirm, which was typical of her. She stood in the door of the Vellard Street studio for a moment looking at the space, the north-facing window, the canvases stacked against the wall, the commission piece on the easel, and then she walked in and began moving slowly from piece to piece without speaking. She spent 11 minutes in the studio. I timed it without meaning to. She stopped longest in front of the Bridge Series piece that had not sold, the large one, the early morning composition, and put her hands behind her back and looked at it. She said, "This is the bridge on Garfield." I said yes. She said, "I drive over that bridge twice a week." She looked at it for another moment. "I've never seen it look like that." I said, "That's what I'm trying for." She turned away from the painting and looked at me directly, with a particular focused attention she brought to things she was deciding about. She said, "You're good at this." I said, "I know." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way my father nodded when he had formed a conclusion he was prepared to stand by, and she said, "Okay." She looked around the studio one more time. She said, "I'll see myself out." She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, and said without turning around, "Tell Daniel I'd like to meet him."
I said I would.
She left. I stood in the studio for a moment, looking at the bridge piece the way you look at something through someone else's eyes after they've just told you what they see in it. Then I picked up a brush and looked at the commission piece on the easel, and went back to the light in the upper third. Danny texted 2 days after the magazine hit stands. She had seen it through a friend. She said someone who worked in commercial real estate who had read the piece and sent it around. She wrote, "Claire, I had no idea. I feel so stupid about Orso.
Can we talk?"
I replied 3 days later. I said, "I know you didn't mean it badly. Let's get coffee. We met at a place on Dunmore Street, the same street where Daniel and I had had our first coffee, though a different shop, and I did not mention that. We talked for 90 minutes. Danny was 26 and working in marketing, and she had the quality that some people have in their mid-20s of being genuinely willing to examine something they'd gotten wrong without excessive performance of contrition. She said the hand pat at Orso had been reflexive, not considered. She said she had looked at me that evening as the younger cousin who needed studying and had not asked herself why she assumed that. I said, "You were following the family's read of me. That's not entirely on you." She said, "It's a little on me." I said, "Yes, a little." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She said, "Is he good, Daniel?" I said, "He bought a painting of mine before we were together, based on the work." She looked at me. She said, "Okay, yeah. Okay." We paid separately and walked out together, and she hugged me on the sidewalk on Dunmore Street with more weight than I expected, the kind of hug that has something in it beyond the moment. I walked back to the parking structure on 5th and drove home to Vellard Street, and I told Daniel about the coffee when he got home that evening, and he listened and he said, "Good." Just that. Sunday lunch at my parents' house was the first week of January. My mother had made the lamb and the rice and the salad with the cucumber and the mint that she made for every occasion that required effort. The table in the dining room on Marsden Road was set for 6, my parents, Rosa, Danny, Daniel, me. Daniel was not nervous. He was careful, which is different. He is a person who enters a room having thought about what matters to the people in it, and he had asked me in the car on the way over 3 specific questions. What my father had built the landscaping business from, what Rosa did for work, what Danny was hoping to do with the marketing job. Not to perform interest. To actually have it. My father shook his hand at the door for a long moment and looked at him with the direct assessment he applied to everything. Then he stepped back and said, "Come in." He said it the way he said things when he had decided something was all right. Lunch lasted 3 hours. My father asked Daniel about OSE Group with a specific curiosity he brought to anything involving the construction and maintenance of physical things, the materials, the contractors, the site logistics, the relationship between design and execution. Daniel answered all of it without deflecting toward the abstract, which I think was the thing that landed with my father more than anything else. Rosa asked about the transit project with the informed precision of someone who had read the Forbes piece twice. Danny asked me, quietly, while we were in the kitchen getting the dessert plates, whether the bridge commission was finished, and I said almost, and she said she wanted to see it when it was. After lunch, my father walked Daniel through the backyard, which my father maintained the way he maintained everything in his life, with specific intention and without waste. I watched from the kitchen window. They walked the perimeter of the yard slowly. My father was talking. Daniel was listening. At one point, my father bent down and did something to the edge of a garden bed, and Daniel crouched next to him, and they looked at it together. My mother appeared next to me at the window. She stood there for a moment, not saying anything. Then she said, "He crouches." I said, "What?" She said, "Some men don't crouch. They stand and watch while your father does the thing. He crouched." She said it like a data point. "That tells you something." I said, "It does." She went back to the sink. I watched my father and Daniel through the window for another moment, the two of them in the January light in the yard on Marsden Road, until my mother called that the coffee was ready and I turned back to the kitchen. The commission piece, the OSE Group residential building in the warehouse district, was installed in the conference room of their offices on a Friday in February. Daniel was not in the office that morning. He had a site walkthrough. The installation was handled by a woman from his team named Petra Hollis, who supervised 2 installers and who sent me a photograph when the piece was hung. The painting on the conference room wall above the long table, the city light coming through the windows on the right side of the frame, the piece catching it the way I had calculated it would when I planned the composition. I sent the photograph to Victor Lane. He replied in 20 minutes, "The light in the upper third." Yes. I printed Petra's photograph and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk in the studio, next to the documentation from the Meridian Regional show. The second Meridian Regional was accepting submissions in March. I had 4 pieces ready. I submitted all 4. Here is what I know now at 28, that I did not know at 19, sitting in a life drawing class at Fenwick Avenue and understanding for the first time what I was going to do. The work does not ask permission. It accumulates on its own schedule, in the hours you keep for it, regardless of who can see it or who has decided in advance that it will not amount to anything. The envelope in my bag from Orso Trattoria is still in the bottom drawer of my desk at home. I have not thrown it away. Not as a trophy. Not as evidence. It is just a piece of paper that contains a moment, my father's fear, my aunt's certainty, my cousin's hand on mine, and all of those things were real, and all of them were wrong, and none of them stopped what was already in motion. What I learned about the people who doubted me is that they were looking at what they could measure. My father measured reliability. Rosa measured outcomes. Danny measured the distance between where I was and where she assumed I should be. None of them were looking at the work. And the work was the only place the answer was ever going to be. You do not build a life to show anyone. You build it because the gap you saw was real, and the thing you needed to make was already there waiting to be made. The rest, the magazine, the conference room wall, the Sunday lunch on Marsden Road, those are what happen when the work has been accumulating long enough that it becomes impossible to ignore. That is all it ever was. The work, accumulating. And the patience to let it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. It means more than I can say to have you here, listening to a story I've been carrying for a long time. If something in this story stayed with you, if you've ever had someone hand you an envelope and tell you to be more realistic, if you've ever built something in the hours when no one was watching, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. I come back every week with a new story, and I'd love for you to be there for it. And if you know someone who is in the middle of the quiet part, the years before the magazine, before the conference room wall, before the Sunday lunch, share this with them. Sometimes the most useful thing is just proof that the accumulation is real. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next week.